to 1308 web series, chapter 7, Photosynthesis, using light to make food. Now we're going to start with chapter 7, Photosynthesis here, but before I do, we always need to compare it to chapter 6 on cell respiration. If you recall, chapter 6, cell respiration, was taking glucose with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, water, and heat. Photosynthesis is going to be the opposite. Photosynthesis is going to take the carbon dioxide and the water and turn it back into the glucose and the oxygen. The glucose that we get in our plants and the oxygen that we get from the plants for the air that we breathe. Okay, so that's how it works here. Here's our first official slide from chapter 7, and that is this nice picture, scenery here, showing you that all life on planet Earth is only made possible by the energy from the sun. No sun, no plants, no us. Okay, next slide. This slide is letting you know that we can do several things. One, living things can capture sunlight using photosynthesis, and that's what this chapter is about. Okay. We can burn the plant matter. So when we burn trees, we burn lumber for our fireplaces, well, it's making heat for us. Where is the heat coming from? It's coming from the energy within the plant. Okay, so that's how we're getting the heat. Our gasoline is coming from plant matter that's been decomposed for so long to make biofuel, to make gasoline, that type of thing. Okay, so that's how things work. So one way or the other, we are renewing it. Here's solar energy. Well, solar energy works very similar to photosynthesis. Solar energy uses the energy of the sun, and we use the photovoltaic cells that you see on the rooftop here in the picture, and they convert the sun's rays energy into electrical current, and that's how we make electricity. Our next slide says the same thing we just said a moment ago. Plants like algae, protists, certain bacteria, these photosynthetic plants, they take light energy and turn it into chemical energy. They basically use carbon dioxide and water to make oxygen as well as to make the sugar products that we typically call glucose. Okay, so that's why it's so important to understand that photosynthesis is just a reverse process of cell respiration. Okay, then in this slide here, basically the same thing. Plants are what? Plants are photoautotrophs. They are producers, and that's what we saw in a previous slide. They're photoautotrophs, and they are producers. Okay, now this slide is important because they asked this on an exam. These are the three categories of autotrophs. We have our plants that we normally call plants. Then we have our protists, like kelp and algae, protists. And this is where your phytoplankton will be here too. And then we have our bacteria, because we do have aquatic bacteria, they call them cyanobacteria, that also do photosynthesis. So this is something to be aware of for the purpose of a test. Okay, next slide. Now, what part of the plant is important? Well, if you remember in the chapter that you had to make flashcards for the plant cell, one of the items you had in the plant cell is chloroplasts. And that's where the photosynthesis occurs. So photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. Within the chloroplast, we have this green color thing that you've heard of called chlorophyll. Okay, so this green thing that's in the chloroplast is for a pigment. And that special chlorophyll pigment actually absorbs light. Very similar to a photovoltaic cell that you see as a solar panel on the top of a roof. Same thing. But this is chlorophyll that does the same idea. Okay. Next, within the chloroplast where photosynthesis occurs, we have these little holes. Now the next two terms I'm going to share with you are very close in spelling, but they are two different things. So the next two things I'm going to talk about, spelling is very similar, but they're two different things. So the one I'm on first is called stomata. Stomata. Now those are actually like little openings, little pores, little gates, little doors, and they're on the underside of a leaf typically. And what they do is, as you can see here, they take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen. And that is the oxygen that we breathe. So plants actually release oxygen through those little tiny holes called stomata. Tiny holes called stomata. Okay, now we go to a picture. And as you've noticed by now, pictures are very important. So in this first picture, we have a picture of a leaf. And at the bottom is where you see the stomata. The stomata is the opening of the pore, and you see carbon dioxide going in, and you see oxygen coming out. Then the next picture, you see a chloroplast. That's filled with chlorophyll. So chloroplast filled with chlorophyll. Now this whole thing on this picture that I'm encircling, this is a chloroplast. Now this is where I say you got to be very careful with spelling and with understanding of the spelling. We see a word called stroma, S-T-R-O-M-A. That is the liquid within the chloroplast. So the liquid space, that liquid space is called stroma. Do not confuse that with stomata. That's why I said the spellings are close. Stomata was the opening, and stroma is the fluid space in the chloroplast. Then we see these little stacks here, these coins. Well, those coins contain the chlorophyll. And each single item or single coin over there is called a thylakoid. So a single coin or a single layer is called a thylakoid. And when you have the entire stack, like stacks of coins, then that's called a granum. So a bunch of thylakoids put together produce a granum. Okay, so a bunch of thylakoids put together produce granum, and that's a stack. This is where the magic will happen. So just like we had mitochondria for cell respiration, where the magic took place, here for photosynthesis, it's going to occur within the thylakoid, within the grana, of course, within the chloroplast itself. Next slide. These are the terms that I just mentioned a moment ago. So here it is in word format. So you can use this slide as a word format. And then here we have our equations. Let me go back to the next slide, actually, which is better. So this is our photosynthesis. So if you look at this picture carefully, it's pretty much the opposite direction of cell respiration. And that's why I kept saying that over and over. Here we have our 6 carbon dioxides, our 6 waters, and then we have our light energy coming in, because it does take light. And then it has production. We're producing glucose and oxygen. So we're producing glucose and oxygen. And it's totally the opposite of cell respiration. Okay. Now, here's where things are weird. It does depend on whether it's during the day or during the night. Now, when I say during day, during night, that's somewhat of a misnomer, because it's really a definition of light reaction versus dark reaction. Okay. Now, dark reaction is not listed on this slide, but they said something as an alternative, and that is Calvin cycle. So Calvin cycle is often called the dark reaction. Okay, so we have a light reaction, and then we have a dark reaction called Calvin cycle. Now, the reason why I don't like to use night and day, because it's not an issue of night and day, really. It's an issue of whether there is more light or less light present. So if we have a really cloudy day, then that's going to still fall under dark reaction, even though it's daytime. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? So don't look at it as night and dark or day and night, but more of, is there more light present or is there more darkness, meaning not enough light? So light reaction takes place when there's plenty of light, and the dark reaction takes place when there's not enough light, even if it happens to be during the day. Okay? So dark reaction is Calvin cycle. Now here's our picture. Now when we look at this picture, it's very, very similar to cell respiration. And that's why I gave the caution at the end of chapter 6. Make sure you know cell respiration, and makes this one that much easier. So in this picture here, we see light coming in. So this is like bright light, daytime, bright light. During the light reaction, we're actually going to take the electrons from water. Okay. So if you recall, in cell respiration, we had the final electron acceptor, which was oxygen, and that allowed oxygen to join with hydrogen to make water. Well, we're just going to do the opposite this time. This time, we're going to get the electron out of water by using light. So light is actually going to strike the water, and that's going to break water apart. And that is what's going to release the oxygen that we breathe. So are you telling me that we're really getting oxygen that we breathe from the plant's ability to take light and split water? That's right. That's where our oxygen is coming from. Our oxygen is coming from the plant's ability to take light and split water. We can't do that, but plants can. Plants can take light, split water, and that oxygen that comes out of the water is the oxygen that we breathe. Okay? Then, what happens to the electron that we took out? So just like in the end of cell respiration, where oxygen picked up the electron, what are we going to do with the electron this time, once we split this water apart? Well, that electron is going to drive the light reaction, which we'll see in a little while. And again, as you can see in this picture, we are producing ATP, and we are also producing, this time around, a different kind of electron carrier, not NADH, but rather a different version called NADPH. Very important not to mess up that difference. So it's NADPH this time that's holding the electrons. Then, when it's nighttime, or when there's not enough light present, we're going to take the ATP that we made during the light reaction, and we're going to take all those electrons that we stored. Again, they're high energy electrons, just like with cell respiration, and we're going to take it into the Calvin cycle. Now, what is the Calvin cycle going to do? Remember the air that we breathe out, which is carbon dioxide? Well, the plants actually love the carbon dioxide that we breathe out. And it's going to take the carbon dioxide and the ATP energy and the electrons from NADPH, and it's going to go around the Calvin cycle, and it's going to make sugar. Now, how many times do you think we're going to go around this time? With Krebs cycle, we just went around the loop twice. But how many times do you think we're going to go around the loop here? And there's a hint in something I mentioned. How many carbons are there in glucose? So if we go back to this picture, we have 6 carbons in glucose. So that means we are going to take our carbon dioxide, which will have 6 of those, and we see that in our previous picture as well. We're going to have 6 carbon dioxides. Well, those 6 carbon dioxides are going to go in and making our glucose that contains 6 carbons. That's why nature has made it a really nice, simple thing. We animals use cell respiration. The plants use photosynthesis, pretty much the opposite process. Okay, so now let's go to the next slide. So again, don't forget, looking at this slide lets us know that light comes in. That light energy is used to break water. The oxygen from water is what we breathe. And the electrons that we broke apart here from water, those electrons are going to be used to run the light reaction, make ATP, store the electrons that we made in NADPH. It's going to go into the Calvin cycle. It's going to take carbon dioxide that we breathe out. It's going to go around this circle 6 times to actually make glucose that has 6 carbons in it. Okay, let's move on. Now the process that I just said, let me back up one more time, that the Calvin cycle's doing, where it's taking the carbon dioxide and making sugar out of it, that's called carbon fixation. That actually is a good thing for global climate. That's how you get rid of the excess carbon dioxide that's causing global warming. So the more plants that you put on the planet, okay, the greater help it's going to be for getting rid of the carbon dioxide that's causing the global warming to begin with. So the oceans will do that. I think I showed a slide earlier, probably in chapter 1 or 2, that showed how the oceans played a role in taking the carbon dioxide, turning it into carbonic acid in the oceans. Well, that's a form of carbon fixation. Well, that's what we're doing here too. Plants play a role in carbon fixation. Okay, and notice it says that's a good example of how we're dealing with the global warming. Okay, next slide. Now this has to do with light itself. All forms of light, like sunlight included, all forms of light have some kind of energy, and that's called electromagnetic spectrum. Some kind of radiation, some kind of energy. And these energies come in waves called wavelengths. So all light has some form of wavelength. Now this picture I'm putting up, you do not have to memorize, but it'd be a good idea to have some general understanding. So here's one. If you have a very short wavelength, see how the number's only 380. That's a short wavelength. That is a very high energy. This is like the gamma radiation that the Incredible Hulk faced when the Incredible Hulk went from Dr. David Banner or Bruce Banner to the Incredible Hulk. Well, that's gamma rays. That's very, very deadly, cancer causing and all of that. So that's very small wavelength. Then we have radio waves. So right now, hitting your head somewhere or another are radio waves that are in the air. Well, those are the lowest energy because they have the longest wavelength. That is something that people ask about. So a short wavelength is high energy. So a short wavelength is high energy, and a long wavelength is low energy. That they ask. So that's something to be aware of. Now, what is a wavelength? Well, it's like a wave in the ocean. It's a measurement from the crest of one wave to the crest of another wave. So the shorter the wavelength, the more energy. Longer the wavelength, less energy. Okay, so that's something that they'll be aware of. And right here in the middle is visible light. Now, they will ask you about the colors of the rainbow. So if you've never heard of this before, they call it Roy G, as in the letter G, BIV, B-I-V. So that's Roy, R-O-Y, then the letter G, and then BIV, B-I-V. And that makes up the colors of the rainbow, Roy G. BIV. And that's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So if you looked at a rainbow, those are the colors that you see. Roy G. BIV. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So those are the colors of the rainbow. Now, having said that, here is a piece of information. Now, normally I skip experiments that they mention, but this one is important. If you look carefully here, if you had a green background, so let's say the light that you're bringing in is filtered with a green colored filter, and that's what they're showing in this picture here. So if you have light coming in and you're filtering it with a green filter, notice what happens. The algae, the bacteria, don't like to grow in green. Because if the plant is green, why is the plant green? Because it's reflecting that color. So that means the light energy, if it's green only, then it's not going to get to the plant. And therefore, it's not going to be the energy the plant is going to use to grow with. Whereas if you look at the other ends of the spectrum, closer to red or closer to the violet side, away from green, then you notice that they grow like wildfire. They grow well. They grow proper, because there the energy of the light is getting through. So if you look at a green leaf, as you'll see in an upcoming picture, if you look at a green leaf, then that means that all the colors of the rainbow and all the energies associated with it are going through, and the only one reflected back is green. Why? Because the chlorophyll is green, and that means it's reflecting the color green. And if you didn't know this, all the colors that you see are actually the reflection of that color back to you. So if you see green objects, it's because that color is being reflected back to you. All other colors are going through it. Okay? Or all the other energies associated with those colors are going through it. Now, having said that, here's something about words. So this is in words. But then I like the picture with it. So here's the picture version that I promised. So here are, why are leaves green? Leaves are green because when the light goes through them, only the green is reflected back, so you see green. All the other colors of the rainbow and their associated energies go through, and that's what the plant will use. And what happens in autumn? When the leaves turn orange. Well, that's because there's a chemical reaction that went on in the leaf, and therefore it changed colors. And when it did that, now the light is being reflected differently, and you see the orange-green kind of leaf instead of the green one. Or you see the orange-reddish kind instead of the green one. We don't really have an autumn in Texas, but if you live up north, they have a true autumn, and you see the green leaves turning red and then brownish and that kind of thing. That's because that color is being reflected back after the chemical change that took place in the plant. Okay. Now, there are two kinds of chlorophylls, A and B. So A and B. This slide is of importance. Let me read it to you for the audio sake. It says chlorophyll A participates directly in the light reaction and absorbs mainly blue, violet, and red light. Notice not green, because remember we said green would be reflected back and no use to the plant. So it's always going to be on both sides of the spectrum, the blue-violet and the red area, not the green. Okay? And then when the plant changes colors, or like say carrots, for example, carrots have a lot of this particular pigment, and that's why carrots are a yellow-green thing, because they have that much of this special pigment. Okay? And it says, which absorbs mainly blue-green light. So yellow-orange, like in carrots. That's the pigment in carrots. That's why we see that kind of a thing. Okay? So it absorbs mainly blue-green, but it reflects the yellow and the orange, and that's why we see carrots, the color that we see. Now here's the same story here. Why do we see the yellow-orange? Because it has changed the pigment. The chemistry has changed, and now it's reflecting a different color because the plant leaf is pretty much dying or changing the chemical reaction. Okay, all right, now, We know that we have a package of energy that comes to the plant leaf. We saw that in this picture here. This little package of energy is called light. Technically, it's not light. We actually call a package of energy light a photon. Just like Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever they have, they say photon. Well, a photon is a package of light energy. That's what a photon is. It's a package of light energy. Okay, right? Okay, so now we have photon, a package of light energy. Next slide. Here's a good example. Now, instead of reading this, let me go ahead and go to the actual image. So here's an example. When you have these glow sticks that you use for camping, where they have two chemicals in a tube, and you actually break the tube so the two chemicals mix, and then you go shake, 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 and the stick starts to glow like this, these fluorescent sticks for emergencies and campouts and things like that. Well, that's exactly how it works. These two chemicals get together, they are chemically exciting each other, and when they excite each other, they glow. All right, so the same idea is here within the plant as well. So here's what we do. The light energy will hit, in the form of a photon, will hit the chlorophyll. So the light energy will hit the chlorophyll. It will excite the electrons. And remember, these electrons are initially coming from the water that we broke apart. And we'll see a better picture later. So when we broke that water apart, we removed the oxygen. That's the oxygen that we're breathing. But then the water also had electrons, and that's the electron we're exciting here. So these electrons are getting excited. And then when electrons get excited and they return back down, that's when they give off heat and light. So the same is true for these glow sticks. When the two chemicals get together, the electrons are excited, and then as the energy wears off, the glow stick wears off as well. Okay, so that's how that works. So the glow sticks produce heat and light as well. Those neon lights that you see that say open or closed for restaurants, those neon lights are like that. They actually have a gas within the tube, and then when you plug them into an outlet, the electrons, the electricity will excite the gas, and the gas will then glow, so you can have a neon light that's red or blue depending upon the kind of gas that you put inside that tube. And when you heat it up or you put it into an outlet and then it excites the electrons, that's when you get heat and light. Okay? So when the electrons come down, they release heat and light. Keep that in mind in this chapter, that heat and light is often released when you release electrons from their energy state. Okay, I don't care for this. I do care for this picture. So in this picture, we're now seeing what I said earlier, but in a better picture. Here's our chloroplast. Here's the thylakoid, those coins, and the stack of coins was called grana. Now, they show that's like a tube within a tube within a tube, like membranes. Same concept here. It looks like a membrane. So what happens is light hits this, the electrons from the water get excited, and then that excites other electrons. And that's what happens. These are all pigments containing some way of stimulating electrons. It's like marbles. One marble hits another marble, hits another marble, hits another marble, and all of these marbles hitting each other hits this final marble that excites this primary electron. Okay, so that's what's happening. Marbles, hitting marbles, and eventually exciting them. Okay, our next picture is this one. And this one now starts off the story. So up to now, I just gave you the story. Now here's a picture that goes with the story. So here's our water again. And remember, I promised you that water is what provides the oxygen, and water is also what provides the starting for the electrons. So when we break water, we get electrons, and these electrons will first kick off and spark electrons to be in higher energy. And again, we see the same idea with the electron transport chain, where we're slowly releasing the electron energy and producing ATP. Now, why do I need ATP? Because I need this ATP to run things in the future. Remember, things don't happen automatically. There has to be some storage of energy somewhere. Your phone doesn't work unless you have battery. And again, you got to charge your battery with some type of energy block or battery block or whatever, right? Some kind of bank in order to do that. So here's what we're doing here. We're charging it, letting the charge go down, and then we're making all that energy stored in the form of ATP. And then whatever energy we have left this time, it goes into a second photosystem. So we have a first and a second photosystem. And the second photosystem sparks again, but this time we store the electrons in the form of NADPH. So this time we're storing the energy in the form of NADPH. Now if I look at this picture carefully, I see ATP, and I see my electrons on ADPH. Now, if I were to go back, and go to a picture I mentioned earlier, which is this one, you can now see the ATP and the NADPH containing or holding the electrons that came from the light reaction that now will go into the dark reaction that goes with the Calvin cycle. So that's what we're about to do. Okay, so going back to where I was, that's this slide here. So we're using the ATP of the light reaction. We're using the electrons that are on this shuttle called NADPH now in the dark reaction. So let's go to that picture. So this is now what's going to happen, and we're not there yet, but we're getting ready to go to the dark reaction. Now, does this look very, very similar to what we had in cell respiration? Yes, it does, because we're doing the same thing. We're moving the hydrogen ions in a different direction against the concentration gradient. So we're using the energy of the electrons to move the hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions, again, like a dam, will go down this ATP synthase that spins like a rotor, like a turbine, and it produces ATP. That part is very similar to cell respiration. So that's how ATP is made here. And then this part is where we're storing the electrons that's left over after photosystem 2 in terms of NADPH. So the electrons on NADPH and the ATP, that's the same thing as this picture right here, where we have our ATP and our electrons on ADPH. Same as what is the end here. And now you can see that both the ATP and the electrons on NADPH are going into the Calvin cycle, which is what I'm moving to next. So here is now the Calvin cycle. Okay. So if you see this picture here, it says ATP, ATP. Well, those are the ATPs from the light reaction. Then we see NADPH, holding the electrons. That's also from the light reaction. And then we have our CO2, and that's the air that we breathe out. So that's the air that we breathe out. That's what plants love, our CO2. So plants are using our CO2 that we breathe out. And then, remember how I said that we go around this cycle overall a total of 6 times? Because we have only 1 carbon in carbon dioxide. We go around 6 times, and as we go around 6 times, we produce what? The glucose. And that's what plants do typically at night or in the dark. So in the dark cycle, this is what the plants do. Okay? So in the dark cycle, this is what the plants are doing. They're taking the CO2 that we breathe and turning it into glucose. They are not making oxygen. So as you can see, when you're in the Calvin cycle as a plant, you're not producing oxygen. You're only going to be producing oxygen during the light reaction. during the day. So during daylight, or when there is a light reaction going on, they produce oxygen, right? So during the light reaction, they're making oxygen. But at night, or when it's dark, in the Calvin cycle, they're just making sugar. Okay, so that's what they're doing. Okay, next slide. All right, now this is all about biofuel here. So there is a way that we can now get algae and all that to actually produce more and more of glucose, or more and more of some type of biocarbon-based structure in a form of almost like gasoline. And that's what they're doing here. So they're making biofuel in this example. Okay. So you can actually get the plants to produce a biofuel, and I think there are some pickup trucks. There are some pickup trucks that actually use biofuel as well. So there are people who are taking the products of what plants make and eventually turning it into some carbon-based, so they can actually make things like gasoline in a way through biofuel. All right, so that is chapter 7. So chapter 7. Okay, now that took care of chapter 6, cell respiration, chapter 7 with photosynthesis. Now, chapter 8 is actually on test number 2, but you're going to find that we're now moving over back into the genetics realm, working with things that go with cell to cell. How are cells dividing to make another cell? That's going to be chapter 8. So how cells reproduce. So cell reproduction will be chapter 8. All right, you're ready to move on to chapter 8.